Buonasera a tutti, grazie per essere venuti. Questo convegno così internazionale è il primo in una sequenza di eventi sulla vita consacrata. Sono molto onorato e contento di avere questa occasione per discutere anche gli aspetti filosofici. Come al solito abbiamo anche il piacere di la presenza del Padre Rettore e dunque cominciamo con il saluto del Padre Rettore.
Carissimi amici, sono molto lieto di salutarvi stasera all'inizio di questo convegno Filosofia e Vita Consacrata e senza indugio desidero ringraziare sentitamente il Padre Luis Caruana, decano della Facoltà di Filosofia, che ha organizzato questo convegno e i tre relatori che abbiamo la gioia di accogliere. Ad ognuno di voi va la mia e la nostra riconoscenza per la vostra presenza e per il vostro impegno in una riflessione che ci interessa molto. Un po' più di un anno fa, il Santo Padre aveva deciso di indire un anno dedicato alla vita consacrata dal 30 novembre 2014 al 2 febbraio 2016. E alcuni mesi fa, in quanto Università Pontificia affidata alla Compagnia di Gesù, abbiamo preso la decisione di proporre 4 serate di riflessione a partire dalle proposte di 4 facoltà diverse. Nella sua lettera del 21 novembre 2014 a tutti i consacrati, Papa Francesco esprimeva queste aspettative nei nostri confronti che mi hanno colpito. Mi attendo che svegliate il mondo perché la nota che caratterizza la vita consacrata è la profezia. E anche il profeta riceve da Dio la capacità di scrutare la storia nella quale vive e di interpretare gli avvenimenti e dunque è come una sentinella. E aggiungeva, è capace di discernimento e anche di denunciare il male del peccato e le ingiustizie perché è libero. Non si tratta di considerare la vita consacrata in un modo atemporale. La lettera enunciava 3 obiettivi: guardare il passato con gratitudine, vivere il presente con passione, abbracciare il futuro con speranza. 3 momenti che richiedono una riflessione, che sia una coscienza viva delle poste in gioco e delle sfide della vita consacrata, della sua missione particolare e della sua responsabilità condivisa con tutti nella vita della Chiesa di oggi. Quanto tanti nella società, nelle nostre società, sono sconcertati, senza punti di riferimento, alle prese con domande esistenziali, in un mondo che vive l'inevidenza di Dio. Dobbiamo prendere sul serio le incertezze e le domande, le aspettative e le sofferenze dei nostri contemporanei. Non è soltanto la responsabilità della vita consacrata, è la responsabilità di tutti coloro che vivono la fede non come un rifugio, ma come un impegno. Se questo impegno è la responsabilità di tutti i cristiani, è a fortiori la responsabilità di coloro che vivono la sequela di Cristo nel modo particolare della vita consacrata. Le grandi questioni attuali sono infatti al fondo e allo stesso tempo intellettuali e spirituali. della profondità della nostra riflessione e dalla autenticità del nostro camminare verso la verità, dalla nostra docilità allo Spirito Santo e dal nostro orientarsi secondo questa bussola che è la ragione, dipende la capacità della Chiesa di essere all'altezza di ciò che richiede la situazione spirituale del nostro tempo. Il mistero di Dio e la figura di Gesù attirano quando e se ne parliamo umilmente, cioè con una autenticità che sia spirituale e umana. Tutto lo sforzo della filosofia e dei filosofi non è di troppo per vivere come sentinelle di una speranza che sia più che mai, e cito il Papa Emerito Benedetto XVI, una grande speranza che ecceda ogni speranza particolare. Vi auguro una bella serata di riflessione comune e grazie mille.
Tante grazie Padre Dumotier per questa introduzione. Senza perdere tempo vorrei presentare il primo relatore di oggi, il professore John Cottingham, professore emerito di filosofia all'Università di Reading, Research Fellow a Heathrow College London, dove eravamo anche colleghi, Honorary Fellow di St. John's College Oxford. È un'autorità nella filosofia, specialmente di Cartesio, e recentemente ha avuto questo interesse con diverse pubblicazioni nella dimensione spirituale. Il suo libro, ad esempio, The Spiritual Dimension, un altro, Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach, e l'ultimo libro, How to Believe, pubblicato quasi una decina di giorni fa da Bloomsbury. Alcune copie sono in vendita fuori nell'atrio. John, we're very happy to have you here with us. Our session will be in English, however there will be an Italian translation on the screen. Ci sarà una traduzione in italiano sullo schermo, però il professor Cottingham parlerà in inglese.
Grazie tante. Devo cominciare a ringraziare il professore Caruana di mi ha avuto invitato. C'è un gran piacere di essere qui. Spero che mi scusate di parlare in inglese, ma è molto più facile per me. Ma c'è un'eccellente traduzione qua. The subject of the paper is adopting a religious worldview. What is it to subscribe to a religious worldview? To judge from the writings of many contemporary philosophers of religion, one would suppose that this is a matter of the intellectual scrutiny of arguments and evidence, and deciding whether these are adequate to support an explanatory hypothesis about the origins of the cosmos, the God hypothesis, as Richard Dawkins calls it. He's an example of an atheist who talks that way, but actually there are many prominent theists. Richard Swinburne is one, who also thinks of God as an explanatory hypothesis. In my view, it's very much more than that. And as I argued in a recent book, How to Believe, yes, Come Credere, which Lewis kindly mentioned, adopting a religious worldview is, amongst other things, intimately connected with praxis, with the adoption of certain regular habits and modes of behavior. To explore this, I thought it might be helpful to look at the reverse process when a vision fades or disintegrates and is lost. An example of the latter, though it's not explicitly a religious one, is found in Mark Twain's description of a decisive shift, a change in his view of the Mississippi River. Yes, a broad expanse of river was turned to blood. In the middle distance, the red hue brightened into gold where the ruddy flush was faintest. There was a smooth spot that was covered with graceful circles and radiating lines, ever so delicately traced on the shore. On our left was densely wooded, and high above the forest wall, a clean-stemmed dead tree waved a single leaf that glowed like a flame in the unobstructed splendor flowing from the sun. But a day came when I began to cease from noting the glories and the charms which the moon and sun and twilight wrought upon the river's face. All the value any feature of it had for me now was the amount of usefulness it could furnish towards the safe piloting of a steamboat. So I hope that's clear, that the narrator's kind of enraptured vision of the beauty of the water and the sunlit woods, at first it seemed so vivid and powerful that nothing could shift it. But slowly this is worn down by the daily work, the daily chores of navigation. And in William Wordsworth's words, the glory and the freshness of a dream eventually dies away and fades into the light of common day. I don't know if we have any Wordsworth fans here. So the reality has not changed, nor have the narrator's perceptual faculties been disabled. It's just that as a result of these daily routines, something has subtly reconfigured his orientation towards the world. Well, there are many lessons here. One of them, I think, is the Italian script working okay? Good. And if you can't hear me or anything, do please indicate and I'll repeat. Now, we sometimes like to think of ourselves as detached, wholly autonomous evaluators, scrutinizing various pictures of the world and deciding which one to choose, which one to assent to. But the reality, of course, is that we are, from the very beginning, from our conception onwards, biological creatures, not only subject to all the physical processes which that implies, but also as we grow and we learn, shaped and formed by what we and others do, by the patterns of behavior into which we're inducted by the demands of upbringing and later education and employment. We human beings are always already located in an embodied world of context and action. Always already, immer schon, that Heideggerian phrase that somehow works in German, but it doesn't really work in English. I'm not sure if it works in Italian. It follows from this that asking about how to believe, about the ways of forming a belief system, needs to be understood as involving reference to action as well as cognition. It's an inquiry about practice as much as theory. You know, of course, the ancient puzzle of Achilles and the tortoise. How can Achilles ever get past the tortoise? Because once he's got halfway, the tortoise will have moved a tiny bit forward, and so on, ad infinitum. The traditional answer is solvitur ambulando, si risolve camminando. It's solved by walking. Do the experiment, run the race, and it's just obvious that Achilles can swiftly overtake the tortoise and win the race. The analogous thought in the religious case is perhaps somewhat as follows. Deciding on whether to accept a religious worldview, which is what most of my philosophical colleagues talk about is something that you can't really consider as a purely intellectual decision made at a safe distance from the context of life and action. So instead of agonizing about how you could bring yourself to accept certain aspects of the creed, let's say, why not run the experiment and start imitating the actions of the believer, see if that makes a difference. Of course, this has resonances with Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea of a form of life, but also goes back much further, at least to Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, who remarked that if you want to cure yourself of unbelief, you should follow the practice of believers. They are cured of the malady for which you seek a cure. Follow them and begin as they did by acting as if they believe. He mentions taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. This will, in the natural course of events, this will make you believe, he says. This will train you. The French word is abattir. Perhaps slightly, the resonances of that are a little bit disturbing. Make yourself like the beasts. But I think it's more to do with habituation, process of behavioral habituation. A certain British monarch, king, I haven't been able to establish who this was, it may have been George V, is reported to have written to his wife after many years of marriage that he had not loved her when they first met, but that he'd slowly grown to love her. I think this wasn't perhaps a very polite comment, but it actually, when arranged marriages were common in royal circles, as they still are in many parts of the world, it may perhaps have been closer to the truth than today's kind of Hollywood idea of love at first sight. L'amore a prima vista. Because the truth is, of course, that you cannot immediately love someone except in the infatuation sense of being strongly attracted to them in some way. The nature of love, genuine, authentic love, implies knowledge, and knowledge of a person necessarily grows over time. And again, there's this contrast I want to make between, as it were, a distant, abstract evaluation and a more involved evaluation. You can't scrutinize the qualities at a distance and see if they are good or bad, or at least if you did do that with a friendship, that would be the quickest way of ending the friendship. You have to allow someone's qualities to emerge spontaneously in a climate of receptivity and nurturing. So action here, the daily actions of consideration and gentleness, will be vital catalysts to allow the possibility of a climate developing in which affection can flourish and ripen into full love. And I think this holds good for religious, for the sensitivity required for a religious outlook to take root. Certain ways of repeated action may be the best way of fostering receptivity, which in turn leads to new perceptions. And these new perceptions may prompt further action, and so on. It's a kind of upward spiral of action, perception, better perception, further action, better perception. And this is not a static or automatic process. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, talked a lot about how habit, the quotation there, can lead to a fossilized residue of spiritual activity. And I think anyone familiar with institutional worship, certainly the compulsory school prayers, which took place when I was at school, and I think probably in many parts of the world, could lead to just that kind of fossilization that Bergson describes, or worse, to a kind of complete disillusionment, as in the Mark Twain Mississippi passage. But in the right kind of praxis, where the relevant actions are performed mindfully, the meaning of what is enacted comes vividly alive, opening up enriched perceptions of the reality being confronted. So the vision is incorporated into someone's life as a fundamental structure that conditions how that life is interpreted and lived. There's a very interesting book by Claire Carlyle, British philosopher who works at King's College London, which is a long quotation there. Actually, most people here know much more about this than I do, because so I'll just read it quickly, but she's making the point that taking communion involves a posture of receptivity. The recipient holds out our hands to accept what the priest offers, bowing her head in thanks consumes the sacrament. The posture embodies the theological idea that her virtue, while genuinely hers, has its source in God. And when the ritual is repeated regularly, it serves as a reminder that helps to maintain in the lives of believers the connection between freedom and dependence, so central to Christian doctrine. And she goes on to talk about how the sacrament is the ultimate expression of receptivity to God, the highest good. Also a gesture of resistance, turning away from trivial pursuits. And so she talks there about a certain dynamic of oscillation, if you like, of receptivity and resistance. The particular dynamic, this is the last sentence, the particular dynamic of receptivity and resistance combines openness and discipline. Simple openness to whatever benefits the practice may bring, and a disciplined attempt to be attentive. So I think what's implied here is that praxis, regular behavior, is not just an accompaniment, a kind of additional accompaniment to adopting a worldview, nor even is it a means, as in Pascal, a means of facilitating accepting the view. Rather, it's part and parcel. It's a part of what it is to accept, to have such a worldview. It's a kind of enactment, an enactment of such an outlook in the life of the believer. Something that can't really be separated from it any more than the smiles and embraces can be separated from a loving relationship. As it were, its very embodiment, not merely facilitator. What applies to the praxis of the ordinary believer holds, I think, in an even more pervasive way in the praxis of those who've taken the vows of a religious order. This brings us to one of the themes of this colloquium, spiritual praxis, where the disciplines of liturgy structure almost every waking hour. A rather nice expression of this by a Benedictine monk and theologian whom I met last year at the Villa Palazzola, just south of here. Liturgical activity transforms cosmic, historical, and biological rhythms into salvation history. The night becomes a time of waiting for the Lord, the rising of the sun, a time to celebrate creation, the succession of daily hours, an ascent to the heavenly Jerusalem, the end of the day, a celebration of redemption, sleep, an act of abandonment in God's hands. In this way, the monk constantly remembers he's not the creator and savior of himself, but that he's a creature, that in God's presence he doesn't exist as a self, but as a thou. So the routines of everyday life are here transformed or sacramentalized by the liturgical structures. Clearly, monastic commitment is not for everyone, but I think it can be argued that in all religious believers, certainly in the great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is a notion of the sacramentality of everyday life. The central idea, again, I think, is that intellectual assent is not really what it's about. It's more about moral orientation, but more than that, it has to be enacted and embodied in this intimate intermingling of belief and praxis that I'm talking about. So I come on to the second section, vision and enactment. There are 4 short sections of this paper, and we're at least halfway through, you'll be pleased to hear. So understanding the practical dimension should be a useful corrective to this tendency I've talked about, particularly amongst academics and intellectuals, to see religious belief as primarily a debating matter, topic for detached discussion. You know, we find the views interesting and want to dissect them and argue about them. It's not, of course, that such theological and philosophical debate is wrong. As a philosopher myself, I'm committed to the idea that we should take delight in using our intellectual and analytical skills. I was trained in the analytic tradition in the Anglophone world, so I'm not in any way criticizing it, but it can be an evasion. There's an interesting recent book by Paul Moser where he talks about spectator evidence, the kind of evidence you can put on the table and just sort of pick up, or have in a test tube and examine. You're just scrutinizing it as a spectator, a watcher. And in doing that, one can be shielding oneself, protecting oneself from the vulnerability that could actually lead one to a change of heart. I'm sure everyone knows the famous quotation of Pascal, "C'est le cœur qui sent Dieu, non la raison." It's the heart that teaches God, that senses God, not reason. I mean, there are actually complications about that in his works, but I think this is one of the truths behind that. I think there's a philosophical lesson here, which I tried to underline in a slightly less recent book published a year ago called Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach. Namely, that we should perhaps question the epistemology of detachment that currently dominates the methodology of the Anglophone philosophical world. This is the idea, really, that philosophy should be modeled on science, that our only valid way of examining the world is a scientific one. It's actually no accident that many philosophers working now are naturalists. That's to say, they want to reduce everything to ultimately the language of physics. And that favors an epistemology of detachment. But instead, I'm suggesting we should substitute an epistemology of receptivity, one which allows that there are certain truths that can be accessed only from a certain standpoint of openness and involvement. As in the earlier example of loving someone, where there are certain truths about a relationship which you can only get access to through involvement. Can't remain detached. In the next paragraph, I talk about an analogy with psychotherapy, I don't know if people are interested in that topic. There used to be a tradition that Catholic people were rather against psychotherapy, partly, of course, perhaps because Freud was so anti-religious. But I think there are very interesting lessons about openness and vulnerability which psychotherapeutic theories have revealed. And one of them is, I think, that it's very easy, sorry, I'm slightly departing from the text, but we're still in this paragraph. It's very easy for an intellectual to say to a therapist, oh, I'm very interested in these theories. I want to investigate Freud or Jung or Klein and discuss the validity of their views. But actually that can very easily be an evasion. The patient wants to avoid getting down to the very difficult task of scrutiny, self-scrutiny. In the Christian Gospels, I think there's an interesting analogy with that, the episodes where Christ is described as looking directly at someone. I take it the point of those stories is that there's something about that direct gaze which cut through any evasion. So the young man who visited Jesus to debate the conditions for salvation clearly wanted to have a nice debate. Look, I've kept all the commandments. Do I or do I not inherit eternal life? And that can be, even after the answer was given, sell everything and give it to the poor, there can still be room for further intellectual discussion. Well, does that mean everything, or is there a certain level of giving which is compatible with one's ordinary responsibilities, and so on and so on and so on. A glance back at the text reveals it's not really about a theory of virtue at all. The text, the gospel text, just says Jesus looked at him and loved him. I think the clear implication is that the loving, compassionate gaze of the other made evasion impossible. And so the young man goes away sad. So I think we may have reached, in some areas of philosophy of religion and theology, a kind of fetishism, insisting that we have to cash out the religious worldview in terms of assent to certain doctrines, the divine status of Jesus, the primacy of the Torah in Judaism, or of the Quran. But what I'm arguing really, and I think it's clear from all those, from the Gospels and also those other sacred texts, that the religious framework is not exclusively doxastic. That's to say, not just about belief alone or doctrine alone, but it involves seeing the world in a way that is a call to change. To accept the terms of religious outlook is to accept one is required to alter one's life, to respond to the challenge of confrontation with uncompromising standards that we did not create. And this brings out a crucial feature of the religious worldview, I think, that is not just descriptive in the way perhaps a scientific theory is, but it's normative, to use that, I think, rather irritating term which has now become entrenched in philosophical jargon. It carries with it, normative just means it carries with it the idea of a requirement, an authoritative requirement. The religious vision characteristically implies a gap, a moral gap, as the theologian John Hare has called it, between how we are and how we ought to be. And the vision, in other words, is of a reality not yet fully accomplished. The latter idea, I think, probably has an appeal for anyone who accepts the objectivity of morality. And it's very interesting, when I was a student, almost all philosophers had a subjective view of morality. That's to say, they thought it was just a matter of your own personal feelings and responses. But now the majority of philosophers, even atheist philosophers, are objectivists. They believe in some form of ethical objectivism. And, for example, Russ Schaffer Landau, which is in the text there, writes, "We humans have created for ourselves a number of different sets of conventional moral standards. These are never the final word. The flaws of any conventional morality are rightly measured against a moral system that human beings did not create." I think that's right, but the very fact that reality is such as to impose requirements on us in this way, whether we like it or not, requirements against which our own rules have to be measured, this seems very consistent with a theistic vision of the cosmos. And for the religious believer, the picture will be of an enduring, eternal moral reality that requires us to change. It's not an abstract requirement, but has to be seen as in direct and personal terms. Each of us has to be prepared to, in a certain way, hold our lives up to the gaze, the scrutiny of a God of unsurpassable goodness and justice. Even to think about that is to realize at once that we cannot withstand that gaze. No one can see God and live, as the Hebrew Bible puts it. And of course the Christian take on this is that we need a savior, an advocate, not just a law or a holy book, but a person who shares our weakness and is an icon, in Paul's phrase, an icon of the invisible God. But once again, I think that remains an abstract idea without specificity. And in the Eucharist, to come back to that example, I think when the priest looks the communicant in the eye and says the words, the body of Christ, then the people lining up it's not just about metaphysics. The very fact of the lining up, the action, in itself somehow conveys that I am no one special, that I'm simply one among many in need of help. So, in other words, that at that moment of rising to one's feet and walking up, one has finally stopped disputing and debating and turned towards the possibility of redemption. That's a very specific Christian image, and it's very dangerous in most universities in the UK, and I think this is true of the USA too, to make reference to specifically Christian ideas or images. There's a kind of orthodoxy now which won't allow any reference to that, won't even allow quotation from the scriptures. In fact, even quotation from poems tends to be regarded as rather a distraction. It's almost as if you've got to stick to the abstract argument and not confuse anything with poetry or literature or scripture. I myself, it's part of my philosophical program that all aspects of the human person should be engaged for philosophical understanding, not just that part of us, the left brain part, if you like, which analyzes and dissects arguments. And that's the importance of practice. But there cannot be action without specificity. So whether we're talking about the Benedictine community example I mentioned a moment ago, or the Islamic salat, the call to salat, the prayers 5 times a day, we find the rhythms of day and night, work and rest, rising and retiring, are woven into the practice of worship, so it becomes incorporated into a pattern of living. And similarly, the rhythms of the year, the liturgical year, the darkness of winter, the light of spring, these are very important matters, I think, not just window dressing. So in excuse me. So in those parts of the world where there's still an Easter vigil, a fire lit on the Saturday before Easter, and the light is brought into the darkened church, and the priest says, "Lumen Christi," the light of Christ. People reply, "Deo gratias." We have an enactment which is more than the sum of the parts. It's not that the performance makes the theory true or the belief system true, but it conveys the meaning more vividly, I think, than any theorizing could do. Yet the praxis needs to be authentic, capable of being enacted in a dignified, sincere, and mindful way. And this can easily go wrong. I have a quotation here from the English mid-20th century poet John Betjeman, who some of you may know, a poem about Christmas. "And is it true, the most tremendous tale of all, seen in a stained glass window's hue, a baby in an ox's stall, the maker of the stars and sea, become a child on earth for me." Sometimes these things don't quite come over in translation, but actually the connotations there for an English reader are rather sentimental and banal. The stained glass, the baby, they just somehow fail to resonate properly. And the repeated question, "Is it true? Is it true?" is in one way exactly the wrong question to ask. It's a kind of sign of loss of authenticity in the praxis. I don't have time to go through the whole poem, but there's much later on, caroling in frosty air, steeples shaking bells, the kind of conventional paraphernalia you see on Christmas cards. I don't know if the practice of Christmas cards is right. This has become a kind of massive commercialized business in England, and the images are nearly always this rather sentimental, sweet kind. They give a vague, warm, comfortable feeling. Now, in this poem, I don't think it would be fair to say the poet mistakes the paraphernalia for the reality. Indeed, it goes on to say that none of these truths none of these objects can compare with the single truth of the incarnation, if it is true. So it's not a case of criticizing the sincerity of the poet, but rather pointing to a certain sentimentality in this cozy vision of Christmas night, which shows already, I think, that it doesn't represent a valid structure of spirituality. It's no longer a live option. It's become a fossilized relic. And I think for many of Betjeman's listeners, it had become just that, as it is for many today. But now, why do I say this question, "Is it true?" is the wrong question? I don't mean that truth is irrelevant or that aesthetically pleasing liturgy can be a substitute for truth. On the contrary, liturgical praxis would be just flummery acting if it weren't grounded in a valid conception of the nature of reality. I think the problem with Betjeman's question, "Is it true, is that it jumps in too quickly, up front, as it were. We have to settle the truth question first. It's rather as if someone jumps in 10 seconds after meeting the girl he wants to marry and says, "Do you love me? I must know, do you love?" It's too soon. Rather like the episode of which Bertrand Russell, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, reports when the young Ludwig Wittgenstein arrived from Austria and burst into his rooms at Cambridge and demanded, "Will you please tell me, am I a complete idiot?" To which Russell replied, "My dear fellow, I don't know." The point is that the question comes too early. More generally, I think to understand the truth, to establish the truth, you need first to understand the meaning. As you know, in the 20th century, there was this movement called logical positivism, where they said the meaning is the method of verification. In other words, first you've got to sort out how you're going to see if it's true or false, and that will tell you the meaning, right? But I think that was the positivists got it exactly the wrong way round. First, you have to know the meaning if you're going to start to assess whether it's true or not. So I think, as I said before in the case of love, you've first got to understand the meaning of love, before you ask whether it's true that X loves Y. And so with many of the doctrines of Christianity. We may not like that, may make it very complicated, a complicated process, but I think our modern age has become too obsessed with quick answers, like some of these Facebook symbols where you like or dislike. It has to be a sort of quick answer. If we're proposing to accept or reject complex doctrine like the Incarnation, we have to first, we certainly can't make a quick assessment of the truth. It's just not possible. I think there's something of that complexity involved we find in another poem written by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who I think was a Jesuit. Yes. It's a good example for this venue. I don't know if you know this poem. It begins, "Moonless darkness stands between. Past, O past, no more be seen. But the Bethlehem star may lead me to the sight of him who freed me from the self that I have been. Now beginning and always, now begin on Christmas Day." Again, I'm not sure if the rhythm and connotations come over if English is not your mother tongue, but it's completely the opposite of Betjeman's poem. Instead of the sentimental images, we have a very direct personal appeal. The speaker sees a glimmer of light which shows the road to be taken. Back to the theme of praxis. I think the kinds of religious practice I've been discussing in conclusion are not just embellishments, beautifications, but they have the function of deepening our understanding so that we can begin to assess the truth. We must do that first, before the truth question. Not just intellectually, but by infusing themselves into deeper layers of our moral and spiritual awareness. If you like clarifying crystals that sink down slowly into the depths of a murky mixture, purifying, refining, letting in the light. Or to take the analogy a bit further, you could even think of the crystals as producing a real chemical change in the substance. It's not just clarified, but the molecular structure is changed, radically transformed. Such image hints at how religious belief may develop and grow when it's realized in a living pattern of spiritual praxis that engages and transforms us physically, psychologically, and above all, morally. For authentic liturgy is not a free-spinning wheel that looks pretty, but a form of practical engagement that orients us towards the moral demand referred to earlier, the demand to change. Authentic religion requires a response of us, and it provides a continuing structure of practical enactment that facilitates and sustains that response. So praxis, of course, can't provide the whole story about what it is to understand the world religiously, nor can it of itself validate any given picture of the world. But without it, the search for truth cannot even begin. Thank you very much.